I'm Matt Cropp.
And I'm Eric Davis.
And we're coming to you live this Sunday, March 23rd, 2014, from VCamp Studios in Burlington, Vermont. And we have a sort of an interesting guest today. But first, we'll be doing a brief discussion of the trip that I've been on for the last month. That we've been on a little bit of a hiatus.
Welcome back.
Yeah, no, it was kind of a wild ride. I was rambling through the South doing oral history interviews with African American credit union people, and started in New Orleans and sort of went across the South. Had my last stop in New York, and then got back on Friday. Had a lot of interesting conversations, and I think a lot of things were clarified for me, and a lot of things that I didn't realize were questions are now big questions. So it's hopefully going to be the beginning of an ongoing project.
That sounds awesome.
But I've got still a few videos to process. But if you're interested in checking out the some of the interviews, you can head over to the Cooperative Vermont YouTube channel. And I have a short excerpt from one of the videos that I shot in Washington, D.C. with the head of the government printing office Federal Credit Union. And we had a really interesting discussion about a lot of things. But in particular, in this piece, we talk a little bit about some of the factors that make credit unions able to take into account a lot more subjective factors in their lending than a traditional sort of for-profit financial institution that tends to rely very much on what are perceived to be objective measures such as credit scores. Mm-hmm. So we'll take a look at that video briefly, and then when we come back, we'll be having a conversation with Don Kreis, who wears many hats in the co-op movement, but in particular, we'll at least at minimum be hitting on his role as a lawyer and talking about the legal structure that the cooperative movement operates under, and also his work with the Cooperative Fund of New England, which has provided both capital and also reinvestment opportunities for a lot of co-ops in Vermont. Mm-hmm. So we'll check out that video, and when we get back, we'll have our conversation with Don.
A lot of smaller credit unions and credit unions that have a pretty specific common bond. So, like for instance, working at the GPO or being members of a specific church parish. Oftentimes, kind of in terms of making loan decisions, the kind of social knowledge, the reputation of people in the community is often a factor in that process. Is that something that you see here, or do you guys more rely on objective measures? How does that work?
Yeah, and that's a great question too. I find it to be a little bit of both. I believe that having members that are the volunteers that people know on those critical committees that they can talk to in the hallway. I mean, I think that's a huge part of what we do as credit unions. It's different than banks, and I think that part does allow for a member to be able to just pick up the phone or walking in the hallway and run into one of the members of the credit committee and just strike up a conversation. I'm okay with that. As a matter of fact, I encourage that because let's say if a loan was to go before the credit committee, I mean, they're sitting among their peers, or before their peers, and I think that's a huge part of what we do as credit unions. Their peers are looking at them and able to render a decision. Certainly, on the lending side, the objective part has to be critical because that's where the professionals we understand how to underwrite. But I think that if there's something that we may miss, or if a member think that we didn't see it right, they have an opportunity to go before their peers.
So your mention of the credit committee, a lot of credit unions have moved to more using loan officers. Can you talk a little bit about sort of having been in the banking sector and in different credit unions, your sense of sort of the differences between using credit committee, using loan officers, or some hybrid of the two?
Yeah. That's an interesting area because certainly being at the bank, clearly underwriting was left with the professionals, and probably as it should be. I get that. However, in credit union world, I think there's value added when someone on a credit committee can look at it from a different angle and say, hey, by the way, let's look at this again. When I was at another credit union, I was totally we understood that the credit committee kind of had run its course. And at that point, we made a decision, or a decision was made that that committee had kind of run its course. Still, you had the appeal process, but in that instance, it would go directly to the board. Here at GPO, FCU, it works just the other way. We still have a credit committee. I know there are credit unions that have gone away from it, and I believe that they're for good reasons. I understand that. It still works for us here. The credit committee is very, very active. We are, certainly we work in partnership with them. Clearly, once a loan decision is made, you're not going to have everyone that's pleased with that. We look at every opportunity to make a loan, and we think that by and large, the majority of the loans are made or denied here, and sometimes they never reach the credit committee. But if a member feels that they'd like to have an appeal, then that process is there for them.
And can you speak a little bit to the folks who kind of choose to serve in the role of a credit committee member? Like, who are the people who kind of stepped up into that role, and what are your sense of like their motivations and things like that?
Yeah, for the most part, in credit unions that I've been a part of, normally you'll have board representation on that credit committee, but it's open to volunteers. Again, I can sit before my peer. Someone that's not looking just at, they're looking at the underwriting guidelines, but they also hear my story. And I think that's critical. I can remember, Matt, if I may digress a little, I remember being at the bank, and there was an individual, and there were times that everything was just judged by credit scores. And you wanted to take as much subjectivity out of the loan process as possible. Sometimes I don't think you can take all of it out, but as much as possible. But when I got over to the credit union world, and I remember as a loan officer, a member came in my office, and this particular member had been turned down. We had turned this member down. And the member sat there, and I just said, I want to hear your story. And when I heard the member's story, I got the opinion then that that member would pay that loan back before they eat. And I made the loan. So again, you want to have, you've got your objective criteria there. But whenever I'm approaching a lending decision, I want to hear the person's story.
So that was an excerpt from one of my interviews down in Washington, D.C., and I took interviews as all sorts of credit unions, everything from institutions with over $1 billion in assets to a credit union that has been run by the same volunteer since 1969. That's in a little tiny prefab building about half the size of a shipping container in a tiny town called Mayersville, Mississippi, and everything in between. So again, if folks want to check out more of those videos, you can head over to our Cooperative Vermont YouTube channel, and they're posted there.
It's a really interesting interview, Matt.
Yeah.
It sort of touches on the social capital aspect. And with that personal touch, it probably makes a lot of business sense too, because as the gentleman was saying, there's that member feels a real bond to both to the institution and an obligation.
Yeah, and it sort of pulls to the surface this kind of tension in the credit union movement as it's grown and consolidated. That common bond was at one point a very important part of the credit kind of underwriting process, and as they've grown and that common bond has gotten looser, it's harder to sort of harness that member social knowledge. And so it's kind of that question of what makes a credit union. A credit union is something that I think is an active debate that we're participating in, but there's a lot of interesting work to be done on that topic. But speaking of people who do a lot of interesting work on many topics, we have with us in the studio Don Kreis. Welcome, Don.
Welcome.
It's a great pleasure to be here. You folks are legendary now in the cooperative movement here in Vermont, and so it's quite an honor to be among the folks who have been asked to be guests on the program.
Thank you for joining us.
So before we get into some of the specific work that you've been doing, do you want to give a little bit of personal background as to kind of your education, your work experience, and how you got involved in the cooperative movement?
Sure. Well, I grew up in the New York area. I went off to college at Middlebury College. I decided to become a journalist. So after getting a master's in journalism at Columbia, I took a job at a cooperative called Associated Press. Perhaps you guys have heard of it. And I worked at the AP for 5 years. I started out in Rockefeller Plaza in New York. I was in Washington for a while. And then I ended up in Portland, Maine, working for the AP. And I left the AP in 1986, I think it was, to go work for a alternative news weekly called Maine Times, which, alas, no longer exists. And while I was at Maine Times, I discovered that I was writing about the law a lot, and it was annoying me that the lawyers I was interviewing couldn't answer my questions to my satisfaction. And so I ended up going to law school in Maine, and law school was an entertainment experience for me. And when I got out of law school, I clerked for a few years at various courts. I clerked at the Federal District Court in Maine, and then I also clerked at the Maine Supreme Judicial Court, the highest court of Maine, and I've also clerked for a year at the Vermont Supreme Court. And so when I moved over here, I live in Norwich, which is on the Vermont side of the Connecticut River in the Upper Valley. And when I moved there in 1997, I discovered that my local grocery store was a consumer cooperative. And because I was something of an entity geek when I was a law student, nobody had to explain to me why this was the coolest thing I'd ever heard of. I mean, the light bulb just exploded over my head, and I thought, it's only going to be a matter of time before I get involved in it. And of course, the co-op I'm talking about is the Hanover Consumer Cooperative Society, which happens to be the nation's second biggest retail food co-op. It has 400 employees and 4 stores and $75 million a year in sales when I checked last. So I ended up getting onto the board of directors, and I spent a year on the board of the Hanover Co-op, and eventually became the president, and I served as the treasurer, and that led me into becoming involved with the Cooperative Fund of New England, and I'm currently the president of the board of the Cooperative Fund of New England, because I really wanted to connect with the co-op movement at a regional and maybe even a national level, and I perceived that capital is the big challenge that co-ops face, and so I wanted to devote myself to that. And the field of law I started out working in was utility law. I was the general counsel of the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission for a while, and I've spent a year as a hearing officer at the Vermont Public Service Board, and I spent 4 years teaching at Vermont Law School, and I still teach energy law courses there online. And at the beginning of this year, I made up my mind to do what I'd been sort of doing on the side all along, which is actually offer my services to cooperatives as an attorney. So I incorporated myself as a little solo law firm, and my business model is very interesting. It's being convinced that if I do what I love, the money will find its way to me. And so I'm very, very pleased to be able to connect with people who are trying to develop co-ops around the state and the region. That's my story.
So I was thinking, to start off talking a little bit about the co-op law side of things, can you provide an overview of what the legal environment is for cooperatives generally, and sort of what, if someone's coming in with very little knowledge, what they should be aware of as kind of the lay of the land?
Sure. Well, the first thing I want to say about co-ops that might be unpalatable to some is that cooperatives are corporations. And so if you're somebody who hates the fact that corporations are people, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, you might be able to take a little comfort in knowing that your cooperative is also a corporate person in exactly the same sense. And like all these corporate entities, they exist as creatures of state law. So every state has its corporate law, and most states have a special statute or several special statutes under which you can incorporate under state law, and you can certainly incorporate various types of co-ops in Vermont under Vermont law by filing articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State and adopting bylaws that are consistent with Vermont law. If you want to form a co-op in Vermont, though, you don't have to incorporate in Vermont. You can pick another state where you think the co-op law is more congenial for some reason. A lot of co-ops like to incorporate in Minnesota just because Minnesota has a lot of co-ops, and so it has a well-developed body of law and a good co-op statute. Or you can incorporate it in any number of other states, and then you just have to register to do business with the Secretary of State here in Vermont. All of that, though, is really just the backdrop, because what really drives cooperative law, I think, is the Internal Revenue Code. You know, like so many things in American culture, what really drives human behavior is how much am I going to owe in taxes? And so it turns out that cooperatives have their very own subchapter of the Internal Revenue Code. It's called Subchapter T. So if you get tired of calling yourself a co-op, you can say, well, I'm a T Corp. I'm a Subchapter T corporation. And Subchapter T is an elaborate mechanism that is designed to minimize the extent to which cooperatives are taxed at the entity level so that co-ops don't have to pay any income taxes. And the trick or the key is you want to be operating on what's known as a cooperative basis, according to the IRS. So what's operating on a cooperative basis? That's your next question, right? Well, this is so important that I actually printed the answer on the back of my business card. Here it is. A cooperative is a business enterprise that does three things. One, limits the financial return on capital. So co-ops can actually issue stock to people who are in it for a return, but this is called subordination of capital. There has to be a limitation on how much profit you pay out that way. And in Vermont, the law is 6%. You can't pay out more than 6%. The second characteristic of a cooperative, according to the Internal Revenue Service, it has to be democratically controlled by its member patrons, each with one vote. So, you know, ExxonMobil is a democracy, but each share gets one vote. So if you own 1 billion shares, you get 1 billion votes. I own 1 share, I get 1 vote. That's not how co-ops work. 1 human being, 1 vote. And finally, and this is the really important one, I think, a co-op, in order to qualify as operating on a cooperative basis with the IRS, has to distribute its earnings to patrons in proportion to their business with the cooperative. So you guys know that that's the insight that the Rochdale pioneers came up with in England in 1844 that made their co-op a success, and that is the key attribute of a cooperative according to the IRS, the legal term of art being patronage. Of course, at a consumer co-op, patronage is how much groceries you buy or how much other consumer goods you buy. At a worker co-op, patronage is how many hours of labor do I contribute to the organization. And at a producer co-op, it's, you know, how many chickens or gallons of milk do I produce or whatever. So that's co-op law in a nutshell.
And so do you have a sense of the kind of historical evolution of that at all? Kind of when you really sort of got that sort of subchapter T and all these structures kind of came into place? Was that a kind of a recent innovation? Had people been running cooperative businesses in a more unincorporated way for a long time?
Well, I think historically, you know, co-ops really came to be prominent in the Midwest because of those Lutheran bachelor farmers who came over from Finland, actually. And so co-ops started to flourish in the Midwest, and as they became politically influential around the time of the New Deal, they were able to start getting these provisions into the Internal Revenue Code that help co-ops avoid taxation at around the same time that the New Deal was embracing co-ops as the way to electrify much of the middle of the United States.
But Don, you mentioned many cooperatives choose to incorporate in Minnesota. What are some of the advantages that the statute in Minnesota offers, and do you see any potential opportunities to sort of improve Vermont statute?
Absolutely. What's good about Minnesota is it has a very well-organized and clear cooperative statute. So, because there's a hierarchy, when you incorporate a co-op, you have to comply with the state statute of the state you're incorporated in, and then you have to comply with your Articles of Organization, which is the document you file with the Secretary of State, and then below that is the bylaws, and they're successively harder to amend. It's fairly easy to amend the bylaws, harder to amend your Articles of Organization, and then in order to amend the statute, you have to get the legislature to do it for you and then have the governor sign it into law. So what Minnesota has is just a very well-written, clear statute that allows co-ops just enough flexibility to do what they want to do around raising capital and organizing themselves, but enough certainty and predictability so that you know what you're getting and you aren't starting a corporate entity without knowing how the law is going to treat you. Now, Vermont, I think, is more typical of states. Our co-op statutes kind of developed gradually over time as people thought about incorporating different kinds of co-ops. So we have sort of an overarching cooperative statute that was really written with agricultural producer co-ops and to some extent consumer co-ops in mind. But it's a bit of a patchwork and it's hard to understand and there's a lot of gaps in it. Then we have a separate statute that covers electric co-ops. We have another statute that covers worker co-ops, and we have yet another statute that covers housing co-ops. And so it's a patchwork, I would say. Just like every traditional stock corporation that's publicly traded in America is incorporated in Delaware because Delaware is considered to have a very congenial set of corporate laws and statutes. I'd like to see Vermont become the Delaware of co-ops. Because I really think that we're the cooperative state. I mean, Minnesota likes to think of itself as the cooperative state, but my theory is per capita, we're more cooperativized than they are. And we're a small state, so it's relatively easy to get things done at the State House in Montpelier. Because everybody knows their legislature, and because co-ops are totally consistent with the public policy of the state. You know, our governor is the cooperator in chief. You know, Peter Shumlin, they caught him on camera at the Putney Food Co-op that he's belonged to since he was a babe in arms. Yeah. They just walked up to him, shoved the camera in his face, and he rattled off this very intelligent disquisition about cooperatives. I will wager that very few other governors around the country can do that.
So when you sort of put forward this aspiration of us becoming the Delaware of cooperatives, what sorts of things, if you were the one writing that reform of the current statutes, what would you do to improve it?
Well, I would make sure that it's very clear as a matter of Vermont law what is or is not a co-op. I mean, it's, as I mentioned earlier, really right now it's the Internal Revenue Code that's driving what defines a co-op. I think cooperators and people who are served by co-ops deserve to know what it means, so that if you walk into a store that's called the Co-op Food Store or the Onion River Co-op, you actually know what that entity really is, and it's not something else that's just calling itself a co-op. So we need to be very clear about that. We need to provide co-ops, though, with a certain measure of flexibility, particularly around how they're organized and how they raise capital. I think we need a measure of transparency so that members of co-ops can feel like the co-op really belongs to them and their co-op doesn't function as a black box, because that's bad for cooperation. Yeah. And then I think we also need to make changes in securities law here in Vermont in order to make it easier for co-ops to raise capital from their members in particular.
So so right now for co-op raising capital, what are the limitations placed on that by the law in Vermont?
Well, the Federal Securities and Exchange Act defines a security, and you don't want to be a security, or you don't want the financial instrument you're issuing to be a security, because if it is, you have to go through a really onerous process of developing prospectuses and registering the security, and there are all these rules about who you can offer the security for sale to, all of that kind of stuff. And if you are offering that security for sale in more than one state, then you're probably running up against federal securities law and the need to register with the SEC. If you're just selling your security as a co-op in Vermont and you're only talking to people in Vermont, then you still have to comply with the state securities law. And even at the state level, securities registration is really onerous. Why do we have these requirements? Well, we adopted them in the 1930s because the stock market crash was created or caused in large part by scoundrels who were peddling fraudulent securities. So we put all these regulatory procedures in place to prevent that. But co-ops are swept in. And even though a cooperative exists to serve its members and not make anybody wealthy, they tend to get swept into securities law. Happily, there is a case that the U.S. Supreme Court decided, called Revis, I think, that says that when a cooperative sells shares to people in connection with their becoming members, so when you make your required capital investment in a cooperative, just in order to become a member, that transaction is not covered by federal securities law. It doesn't meet the definition of a security under the Securities and Exchange Act because it's clear that the person investing isn't investing in the co-op in order to maximize return the way other investors do. And so it's not a security as defined by federal law, and most states, including Vermont, use the same definition of a security in state law as the Congress did in the federal securities law. So joining your co-op, buying member shares, not a security, no registration requirements. Everything else, including member loan programs, arguably do implicate securities law, and that's very complicated and unpleasant.
And so, what when a co-op does want to raise capital for its an expansion or founding, what options are available to it under the current regime?
Well, I still think that a member loan program is the easiest and most straightforward thing to do. Who are the people that are most likely to want to loan money to their cooperative? The members. And oftentimes members have wealth that they can invest. And I think if you look at the history of cooperatives, particularly here in Vermont, you'll find that co-ops are a sound investment compared to other kinds of business corporations. I should say we have a bigger problem than just funding co-ops. It's very hard for local economies to amass capital because of the way the securities laws are written. And of course, Congress passed a crowdfunding statute in order to make that a little bit easier, but the Securities and Exchange Commission hasn't finalized its rules yet, so we don't know how that will play out. I think that mechanism will benefit co-ops, so that if you follow certain rules and do something on a fairly small scale, I think it's a $500,000 limit, co-ops will be able to raise money that way. Then, of course, there are other mechanisms by which co-ops can actually take on outside investors, and as long as you don't give them voting rights, you still meet the definition of a co-op according to the IRS and most state laws. And then a lot of states have adopted these limited cooperative association statutes that actually allow entities to form corporations that call themselves co-ops basically, but actually have a class of members who are just investors. And that statute typically says that as long as those investors don't become a majority of the seats on the board of directors or the voting shares, then that's okay. I should say we adopted that statute here in Vermont, but we went to the legislature, I and a couple of other people, and said, this is all well and good, it's a great statute, but this new kind of entity isn't really a cooperative, because entities that are potentially controlled in significant part by outside investors aren't really consistent with the cooperative principles. And so we persuaded the legislature in Vermont to allow those entities to exist. But here in Vermont, they're called mutual benefit enterprises. And we strengthened the law in Vermont around what can call itself a co-op, so that if you have outside investors, I would say it's difficult to call yourself a co-op unless you're really organized like one.
Have you seen the mutual benefit statute help co-ops raise capital? Has that played out in Vermont?
I have not, but the co-ops that I tend to interact with are at a relatively small scale. I think it's fair to say that the Limited Cooperative Association Act was written in order to help larger agricultural co-ops.
So can you talk a little bit more about that question of you said this law was passed that really put forward a stronger definition of what is and isn't a cooperative, and what can and cannot legally call itself a cooperative. What are some more of the details of that, and how has that been used to specifically kind of call out any organizations that have been maybe abusing the cooperative brand or mark or what have you?
Well, not to my knowledge. This is a fairly recent phenomenon in Vermont, and it's pretty clear that if you were just a conventional business and for some reason you use the word cooperative in your name, this comes up occasionally, and the Secretary of State will tell you that you cannot register your business under that name in Vermont because of the way our law is written. But to my knowledge, I don't think there have been any examples of organizations that are sort of but not really cooperatives getting into trouble with the Secretary of State. And I think hopefully that'll happen relatively infrequently, because we want all the co-ops in the state to actually act like co-ops, organize themselves like co-ops, and not get into trouble.
So recently in Vermont, we had the issue around the healthcare. I guess it's not a cooperative, but it's a consumer-owned and oriented plan. So they get to use the acronym co-op.
That's a very interesting phenomenon, because what you just described, Eric, is something that was included in the Affordable Care Act. And, in the Byzantine deliberations that led to the, just barely passed Affordable Care Act, one of the things that emerged was, as an alternative to like government-run health maintenance organizations, they authorized these organizations called consumer organized and oriented plans. Cleverly, that is, the initials form the word co-op. And so, because federal law preempts state law, I think the fact that those organizations were allowed to organize under the Affordable Care Act and get lots of money from the federal government and call themselves co-op, capital C, capital O, hyphen, capital O, capital P, I think they would have been allowed to, it would have been very difficult for us as a matter of state law to tell an organization like that in Vermont that it couldn't call itself the Health Co-op. And you'll notice the one that tried to form itself here in Vermont always spelled that word, C-O-O-P, in capital letters. That's because that's the way it appears in the Affordable Care Act.
And I was wondering if you might want to give a little bit of your thoughts on sort of the way that organization, the trajectory of that organization in Vermont. It basically had it launched, it attempted to start doing business, and the regulator kind of came down on it. What were your thoughts on that episode?
It was our state Department of Financial Regulation that decided not to grant a charter to the Vermont Health Co-op, and it was concerned about the way the co-op was organized. There were issues around self-dealing, and I think. I don't know the people that formed the Vermont Health Co-op, so I have no opinion about them personally, and I don't have any reason to think they were proceeding in bad faith, but what they were creating wasn't a cooperative. And it was, there was a sort of self-perpetuating board of directors and a lot of opportunity for doing things that I would say more resemble a conventional wealth-maximizing business. And that troubled the financial regulators in the state, and so they were not chartered, and I guess they gave up after that.
And so one other thing, just kind of from the perspective of you having recently gone into the practice of cooperative law, what are the sorts of issues that, as an attorney, kind of the cooperatives sort of need your kind of services for?
Well, co-ops need to figure out where and how they're going to incorporate, under which statute, in which state, how to draft articles of organization that are consistent. If you read the Vermont statute, you'll see there are certain provisions that the law says have to be in your articles of incorporation. And then you want to draft bylaws that describe a cooperative form of doing business. One thing you want to be really careful about is making sure that your bylaws create an organization that takes advantage of the provisions in subchapter T of the Internal Revenue Code. And there you get into these Byzantine things called qualified and unqualified written notices of allocation. Basically, you want to make sure that every time you take your net earnings and you either pay them out in cash to the members or you allocate them to the members by issuing shares to them or adding to their capital accounts, you want to make sure that you qualify those allocations for non-taxation to the co-op, so that you want to pass the tax obligation on to the members. And there's an elaborate process that you have to use in order to make sure that that happens. And the nice thing about what happens when you do that is that if you're a consumer co-op and you allocate the tax liability to members, the members don't have to pay any income tax, because when patronage refunds are paid to individual consumers on consumer goods, the patronage refunds are not taxable to the consumer. So if you're shopping at the food co-op here in Burlington, you will never, as long as you're buying your own groceries and not buying groceries for your company, you'll never have to pay income tax on your patronage refund. Unless they change the Internal Revenue Code and abolish that, which I doubt they will do.
So before we leave the co-op law piece, we were talking earlier about statutes in Vermont, and Vermont has had a bit of an appetite to create statutes that target certain industries, for instance, the captive insurance business. Do you sense that there's any appetite in Vermont to revisit the cooperative statutes?
Well, I have that appetite, and I think that when we succeed in forming our statewide association of Vermont co-ops, we'll be able to get together and agree on the way that we would like our cooperative statute to look. And I think we would all like Vermont to be the cooperative state. And I think one way of doing that is making Vermont a very attractive state for cooperatives to incorporate in. I have a specific idea. I would like to see Vermont become, if not the Delaware of co-ops generally, the Delaware of what some people call multi-stakeholder co-ops and what I like to call solidarity co-ops. And those are co-ops that have different groups of members. The ones that I know about are co-ops that have a group of employee members and a group of consumer members. So you can start a food co-op that's owned jointly by both its employees and its consumers. And I think that's a pretty compelling form of organizing a co-op. It starts to get at a lot of the labor issues that tend to beset consumer co-ops. And it's an emerging form of cooperative organization. The province of Quebec has a solidarity co-op statute that I believe works pretty well if you happen to be a Canadian co-op. So we need an American counterpart, and we are just the state to do that.
Well, changing hats, sort of. You're also the chair of the board of the Cooperative Fund of New England?
That's right. Yes, I'm the president of the board of trustees of the Cooperative Fund of New England. And so you're about to ask me, what is the Cooperative Fund of New England? Well, you know, the United States Treasury charters financial institutions called CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions. And they really function as commercial banks, and their job is to go into communities that are economically challenged and help them develop economically. And so the Cooperative Fund of New England began, I think, in 1974. It became chartered as a CDFI, which means we get to be a bank in essence, but we don't have to go through all of the regulatory rigmarole that banks and credit unions have to go through. And we loan money to cooperatives of all types all around New England. And one of the things that's cool about Cooperative Fund of New England is that as a co-op that borrows money from us matures and becomes a success, we often see our borrowers become our lenders. So you pay the success forward by taking some of the extra money that you have as a co-op and you invest it in the Cooperative Fund of New England.
And what's the sort of the trajectory of the Co-op Fund of New England? When was it founded, and what have been the sorts of co-ops that have really driven its growth over the years?
Well, it was founded in 1974, and I think certainly food co-ops and Fedco seeds and sort of consumer-oriented co-ops have always been a mainstay. But now we see a lot of worker co-ops are really a big emerging cooperative sector, and so they're coming in front of us to ask for money. We loan money to housing co-ops. A lot of the student cooperative housing that you find in college towns like Cambridge and Providence, they're in our loan portfolio. We certainly have loaned to agricultural co-ops, many of which are here in Vermont. Just about the only kinds of co-ops we don't loan money to are electric co-ops because they have their own source of capital, and credit unions because they have member/depositors. So, and it was very interesting watching the interview, Matt, that you were doing with that fellow from the GPO credit union, because he was talking about their loan committee. And I serve on our loan committee at the Cooperative Fund, and much the way he was describing, it's very rare, almost unprecedented, for our loan committee to tell a cooperative no. We like to work with our borrowers to get them and us to a point where they're comfortable borrowing from us and we're comfortable lending to them. And our co-ops, the more cooperative-ish our borrowers are, the more reliable they are, I find, as borrowers. And so as a result of that, the Cooperative Fund has an excellent track record. Very, very few of our loans go bad. In fact, I almost hope more of them would go bad, because I think we should be a little more, we should have more appetite for risk, because that's how we're going to grow the cooperative movement.
Is there a typical, what's the range in loans that the Cooperative Fund of New England deals in?
That's a great question. We will make loans that are very small if you want, and I think the biggest loan we've ever made is about $850,000. And we tend to do secured lending, which means that we want either collateral or some kind of personal guarantee from people who are starting a co-op. But we realize we're trying to look at ways to be able to loan money to co-ops that don't have collateral, because if you start a worker co-op to make upholstery or grow crops or open a store of some kind, chances are you probably don't have a lot of collateral when you're starting. That's why you need money. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at ways to try to make loans that are either poorly collateralized or not collateralized. But it's a challenge.
And so, with that kind of in terms of, so do you, at this point, have you mostly been making loans to kind of already existing co-ops to sort of help their expansion because they do have collateral to put forward? Or does the Cooperative Fund really work with many like true startups, kind of co-ops that are just in the very beginning of the organizing phase?
We most certainly do work with true startups, and a couple of cool things that the Cooperative Fund does. We have been willing to serve as a so-called fiscal sponsor for startup co-ops. So we'll help you raise money, and at the cooperative development stage, you actually are making a tax-deductible contribution to the Cooperative Fund, and then we'll use that as seed money to help the co-op do things like create a market study to determine their feasibility and, create some initial staff positions so that it can really start to do a serious membership drive. Oh. So that's one thing we do. And then for some co-ops, we've solved the member loan securities registration process by basically becoming the entity that you are technically loaning money to if you're making a member loan. So you guys could loan money to the Cooperative Fund, and then the Cooperative Fund agrees to take the money that you lent to the co-op fund, and we will in turn lend that to your co-op. And so we're using our lending capacity as a CDFI to streamline the process and avoid securities registration.
So you mentioned that many of the startup co-ops actually, once they get up and running and pay back their loan, become a lender. What sort of, is it mostly cooperatives that are loaning money, or what's the range of sort of folks who contribute to the Cooperative Fund?
I would say our major investors are cooperatives, successful cooperatives that have some extra money to lend. Also, religious institutions. My favorite one might be the Episcopal Diocese of Hartford, Connecticut. And so what happens is, you're an Episcopal person and you love your Episcopal church, and so you leave your estate to the church. Well, what's the church going to do with that estate? It has to invest it somehow. So these churches look for socially responsible investment opportunities, and the Cooperative Fund is considered a socially responsible investment opportunity. We pay a relatively low rate of interest, but if you're a socially responsible investor, you're typically willing to take a lower interest rate in exchange for the knowledge that your money is being deployed in a socially responsible way, and also more reliability, because we've always paid back all of our loans, which not every entity that you can invest in can make that claim.
Right. And so the employees of the Cooperative Fund, what is their role? Is it to sort of provide technical assistance, to do outreach? Kind of what how does the actual staffing work?
Yes, we do both of those things. So if you're a co-op and you would like to consider borrowing money from the Cooperative Fund, you call up Betsy Black, who is our fellow Middlebury alumna and our representative here in Vermont, and she will come and meet with you and help you develop a loan application and advise you about whether you're really in a place of being ready to borrow money from either us or a bank or both. And then she'll develop a loan application, and then your loan application comes before our loan committee, which is like the credit committee of a credit union. It's comprised of various people many of whom are on our board, a few of whom are outside advisors, and we tend to meet by telephone once a month. So we get on the phone with these borrowers and we kick around what we can do to get them to yes. You know, in a traditional lending situation, they talk about the 3 C's, right? Cash, collateral, and character. And so in a cooperative context, the character, I think, is sort of replaced by cooperative, or cooperation, or cooperativeness. Because, again, I feel like the more committed you are to being a cooperative and really operating under the cooperative values and principles, the more creditworthy you are. I should say, to cycle back to what we were saying earlier about co-op law, the cooperative principles are not legally binding. I mean, you can go on the International Cooperative Association website and read the cooperative principles that they have duly promulgated, and they may be binding somewhere on the globe, but they're not binding in any U.S. jurisdictions.
Huh.
So if you take those on, you take them on because you're principled.
And what is the when you kind of look at the spread of what the organization has done up until now, is there a sense of that there's kind of some new projects or new approaches that you're kind of working on to add to the fund's work in the future, or how does the kind of next phase of growth for the fund look?
Well, as I said, we're trying to make riskier loans by finding ways to loan money to co-ops that are under collateralized, and also, you know, we're working on deploying our capital in food deserts and in cities that are economically challenged. We just approved a loan to the Wellspring Upholstery Co-op in Springfield, Massachusetts. That's going to be a worker co-op that is going to employ people who are fresh out of being incarcerated, teach them to be upholsterers, hopefully create opportunities for them to have an economically viable life, and then they'll become members and therefore owners of their cooperative.
So the Cooperative Fund of New England plays a really important role in that capital is it's oftentimes difficult to raise for a co-op. The Jobs Act, I believe, created a lot of opportunities for sort of micro lending. How do you see the cooperative sort of capital playing out in the future?
I actually think the crowdfunding provisions of the Jobs Act could be very helpful to co-ops, particularly co-ops at a fairly small scale, because there are some limits on the amount of crowdfunding you can do. And so I'm waiting to see what the Securities and Exchange Commission does by way of finalizing its rules, because until the SEC does that, we won't really know how easy this crowdfunding thing will really be. I mean, it's not going to be a free-for-all. There'll be rules, and you can't just... We couldn't just go on this TV program and say, all right, send your money to the Onion River Co-op because it's crowdfunding now. You have to go through an intermediary, and it'll still be fairly complicated, and there'll still be some registration requirements. And I suppose that's fair because, you do want to make sure that the law protects us from genuine scoundrels who might be tempted to abuse the law. Mm-hmm. So I'm optimistic, but I'm waiting and seeing. The SEC has put out its proposed rules, and people are commenting on them. You can go on the website of the Securities and Exchange Commission, download the rules, and see if you like them, and write to I think the comment deadline is passed, but you can still certainly complain about them.
Okay. So, looking at the rest of the country, the Cooperative Fund of New England, by its very name, is naturally constrained to our region. Are there other similar organizations that are doing work in other regions, and are there kind of relationships? Like, what is there any kind of larger cooperation in terms of this mission of making capital available to co-ops?
Well, actually, there is, to my knowledge, only one other CDFI in the United States whose sole mission is developing cooperatives, and that's the North Country Cooperative Fund in Minneapolis. And they're actually organized as a cooperative. It's very interesting. But there are other cooperative organizations that are working very hard. All of the national co-op organizations are looking at this and thinking about ways that they can develop funds that they'll be able to loan to cooperatives around the country, because unless you're an electric co-op and you have your own electric co-op financing instrument, or a credit union that can basically borrow money through the insured, the NCUA, it's very hard to get credit if you're a co-op. So all of the national groups and all the regional groups understand that this is a problem, and they're all working on it. One thing I've heard that people talk about all the time is getting people who work at co-ops to have some kind of fund that they can invest their retirement assets in.
Huh.
Yeah, I know for myself, when I was working at my last job, that question of where your retirement money is always a very interesting one. And they had a set retirement plan where there's a handful of funds you could choose what the money was invested in, but I couldn't just go and say, hey, I'd like this money invested in co-ops. There just wasn't that flexibility.
You mentioned retirement. One thing that I have noticed that you see promoted a lot these days are ESOPs, right? Because you start a business, you build it up, and you decide, okay, I'm ready to retire, I'd like to cash out, so I want to sell my business. Well, who am I going to sell it to? Oh, I think I'll sell it to my employees. And there's some favorable provisions in the Internal Revenue Code if you're going to do that. And so the typical mechanism for doing that is an ESOP, or employee stock ownership plan. But that turns the company into a retirement fund largely, and it isn't the same thing as the kind of workplace democracy that you get if you form a worker cooperative. So I think what a lot of business owners don't understand is that you can take the same tax benefits under the Internal Revenue Code that you get when you cash out by selling to an ESOP, and you can also get those same benefits if you sell your business to a worker co-op that your employees form in order to take over the business. And you can loan your workers some money in order to do that. In other words, you can have them pay you over time, and you can do a bunch of other things to create worker co-ops. And I think companies that are considering ESOPs should also consider worker co-ops for that reason.
Do you see opportunities, Don, to have this play out where employees can invest in the company? What kind of opportunities do you think are there?
Well, I think the worker co-op model is particularly useful for small businesses because ESOPs, there's another federal statute called ERISA. It's the very complicated regulatory statute involving retirement plans that's designed to make sure that your retirement assets don't get looted by whoever's managing the plan. So ESOPs are subject to ERISA. Worker co-ops are not, because they're not retirement plans. And I think that for any small business, it's an effective option. I'm excited about it for country stores and little businesses that do things like install solar panels or almost anything that functions at the community scale. And of course, everybody knows, I think, that we need to reform our economy in general to give people opportunities to invest locally, so that all the wealth that we generate isn't extracted anymore. And I think co-ops have a big role to play in that.
And looking at the work that Cooperative Fund of New England is doing, and the North Country Cooperative Fund that you mentioned as well, do you think that that these are the sorts of institutions that can really through reinvestment bring forth kind of a more integrated cooperative economy, or are there other pieces of the puzzle that you think still need to be worked on in order to kind of make that happen?
I would say that at least here in New England, we need to work hard to develop more cooperative capacity. We need to create more cooperators. We actually have trouble sometimes finding borrowers. So we have money to loan, and we're looking for credit-worthy cooperatives, and we need to go out there and start them. So we need to deploy technical assistance more than we currently are, so that when people are looking to create enterprises in their communities, they know that the cooperative model is there. One thing I've noticed, the Littleton Consumer Cooperative Society over in New Hampshire started because some folks in Littleton wanted the Hanover Co-op to open a store for them. And I was on the board of the Hanover Co-op at the time, and we said, no, we don't want to open a store in Littleton, it's too far away. But why don't you start your own co-op? Then you'll run it and own it, and it'll be autonomous, and we'll help you. And that's what happened. And what I discovered working with the folks in Littleton is that we're all so socialized to compete with each other as Americans that it took them a while to figure out that we were serious. Like we were willing to tell them everything we knew about the grocery business. And provide them with material assistance and insight. All of our, whatever trade secrets we had were theirs. And they couldn't believe it at first. Well, they came to believe it.
So we're looks like we're running pretty short on time. But are there any other kind of thoughts about the cooperative movement, either here in Vermont or the legal side of things, or any challenges that you see sort of in our future that we need to be thinking about and addressing as we go forward?
It would be great if more law students got interested in cooperatives. To my knowledge, there are no law schools right now that are teaching courses in cooperatives. Every law school offers a course called Corporations or Business Associations, where you learn about entities, and co-ops need to assume their rightful place in the curriculum there. The same thing is true of business schools around the country. The fact is, as you guys know, co-ops are the secret success story of the capitalist economy. I mean, since 1844 and the Rochdale Pioneers, no form of enterprise has been more successful and has been more true to not looting wealth from communities. And so it needs to be in there when people are studying how to form business organizations. So I would like to see law schools in particular become more cooperatively aware, particularly the Vermont Law School where I teach. We're working on that.
And if people want to learn more about the legal work you're doing, do you have a website? What's the best place to find out about that?
Well, my website is law4coops.com. I haven't quite gotten around to registering a .coop website, so it's law, the number 4, and then coops.com. Or you can go on the website of the Cooperative Fund of New England and learn about the Cooperative Fund. That's coopfund.coop. Or you can Google me. I'm very Googleable, if you spell my last name correctly.
Well, thank you so much, Don.
It's been a great pleasure. This program is doing as much as anybody in Vermont to spread the word about co-ops, and that's really important and valuable as we become ever more the cooperative state.
Well, and we'll definitely keep you in mind if there are any co-op legal issues that emerge, if we need some expert opinion in the future. But for those out there who joined us late, you've been watching Cooperative Vermont. We do this show every 2 weeks, bringing different stories and different conversations with different people from the Vermont co-op movement, and sometimes beyond as well, but of interest to Vermont cooperators. We don't have a firm guest for the next show, although we have gotten a message from someone from the Cooperative Development Institute. And there's a really interesting story around some, I think it was a trailer park or a mobile home park that was recently converted into a housing cooperative. Yep. And I think that would be, if we can get that story, I think that would be great.
Yeah, I think there's a fair amount of movement in towards cooperativizing mobile home parks.
So we might have that on next show, or we might have something else. But as always, in the meantime, you can check out the full episode on our YouTube channel if you just go on YouTube and search for Cooperative Vermont. And you can also find any news that we pick out related to Vermont co-ops during the week on our Facebook page. Again, Cooperative Vermont. We've also got a Cooperative Vermont Twitter. So if you're tweeting around, that's a good way to follow what we're up to. So until next episode, I'm Matthew Cropp.
And I'm Eric Davis.
Good night.